Welcome. Thank you for joining our Quality and Auditing Practice Best Practice Series webinar. I'm Becky Melody, your hostess for today's presentation. Bob Lucchese, Vice President and Subject Matter Expert for USDM Life Sciences, will be presenting. The discussion today will cover introductions, webinar logistics, and our discussion topic, incorporating risk into your audit process. We're proud to have Bob Lucchese as Vice President leading the USDM compliance team. He offers more than 25 years in quality assurance and regulatory compliance in pharma, biotech, medical device, engineering, and nuclear industries. His expert extends to the several USDM practice areas, including quality and auditing, enterprise quality management, ECM, as well as our governance, risk, and compliance. Among his many accomplishments, Bob has presented on multiple compliance and regulatory subjects worldwide, including the new ASTM E2500 model for validation. He led audits for team policies and procedures, Part 11, NIST, Supplier vendor, both internal and external, mock recalls, and major life sciences assessments. Bob is an expert in risk-based validation methodologies, GAMP, ECM, data and content migrations, and overall pharmaceutical and medical device regulatory issues. Bob has worked with small, medium, and large life science firms worldwide and is a recognized leader in his field. USDM is focused exclusively on the life science domain. We're the market leader in providing quality and regulatory IT compliance professional service solutions. We're headquartered in Santa Barbara, California, and we've delivered more than 1,000 successful projects with over 300 life science clients. We offer hands-on experience assisting clients under regulatory distress, and we're the market leader for validation accelerator packs. Our various practices include IT and virtualization, GRC, laboratory, ECM, ERP, PLM, enterprise quality management, manufacturing automation and equipment, clinical and drug safety, business intelligence, project management, and of course, quality and auditing. In addition, we have subject matter experts on board to support compliance in the nutraceutical industry. The content of today's presentation will be covered in approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll invite you to post questions for our team via the iLink message board on the lower left of your screen. Or you can join the discussion on LinkedIn and post any questions there. We're happy to address questions offline as well if you want to shoot us a note at usdm@usdm.com. Thanks so much for joining, and now I'll turn the presentation over to Bob.
Thank you, Becky. Appreciate that. And welcome, everyone. Glad you could join us this afternoon for this topic on incorporating risk into your audit process. This is one of many in a series that we're doing on auditing. There's a lot to cover within the risk-based approach to auditing, so certainly look for upcoming webinars in the next several weeks that we'll be doing. It'll be myself and members of our auditing team presenting these webinars. We've done a couple already in the past, so certainly look on our website for some previous webinars we've done on audits to get you all caught up here. Today we're going to be talking about incorporating risk into the actual audit selection process. The agenda basically is going to cover determining critical versus non-critical vendors. So a lot of times we're asked in the industry, how do we know which vendors to audit, which vendors do we need to do a minimal audit or perhaps just a questionnaire or no audit at all? So we're going to go over some of those factors leading into critical versus non-critical. Secondly, we're going to determine the level of audit that we need to do. Again, how detailed should these audits be? What type of questions we should ask? and how far we should take those audits within the complexity range. Next, we're going to talk about how to expedite the entire auditing process, talking about incorporating risk into when you actually decide to do an audit. How far do you take that audit? How long would it take? And how you could mitigate some of the areas within the audit process itself. I'm also going to go over a quick case scenario for you, explaining how I got to a certain point through that scenario based on the previous material that we'll be talking about this afternoon. And finally, I'll just do an overall summary recapping what we spoke about today. So first of all, the whole external supplier vendor audits really came about a few years ago with the initiation of the track and trace that the FDA really wanted us to focus in on. And that's really taking a look at cradle to grave type of operations within pharmaceutical and medical device operations. So for instance, they realize that you may have a good quality program within your organization. However, all the parts, all the ingredients, all the other suppliers that you're using, they wanted to make sure that obviously they have a good quality program in place as well. So therefore, they really started to come down hard on the industry to make sure that companies follow the external auditing process. And therefore, we've been extremely busy over the past few years helping companies out because of bandwidth. So this webinar today hopefully will get you on the right track. If you're either a supplier vendor or more importantly, if you're a pharmaceutical or medical device company on the phone today listening to the webinar, hopefully this will help you determine your level of audits that you're going to need to conduct, or if you've already been doing them, how to take care of sometimes the bandwidth problem. So some of the questions and problems that we've seen in the industry, folks, are as follows. The first is, are my vendors or suppliers critical to my business process or not? In other words, what do they supply to us, and how critical is that component, whether it be a small part or some type of excipient, ingredient that goes into our process for pharmaceutical drugs or obviously the medical device field as well. Do I conduct on-site audits or some other type? So this is a question we get asked a lot because of bandwidth, because of expenses and budgetary reasons within an organization. Certainly on-site audits take time to travel. They take time during away from your own personnel as well as the personnel at the vendor and supplier. So we're going to be talking about whether or not to conduct on-site audits, and I'll go over some of the other types as well. Next, are there different questions to ask based on the type of vendor? So one size really doesn't fit all for auditing, and based on the type of supplier you're dealing with, there are different questions that you can ask, and we'll go over some of them during this presentation. What length of time to allow for any given audit? We get asked this a lot. Is this a one-day audit? Is it a 3-day? Is this going to take a week? How many folks do we need to bring to the audit? How many people do you need on their end as well for hosting? So we'll go over some of the time differences within the audit realm as well. Next, can I speed up the overall process for my auditing needs in my company? So here we're going to take a look at some of the risk factors involved for determining all of those auditing needs within your own company. And then finally, can I apply risk factors to determine all of the above? And the answer is yes, and we're going to go over some of them today. Again, within risk, I've done a lot of conferences and talks all over the world around risk-based approach, say to validation. We've taken some of those components of that process into the auditing process. So it's a scientific method. However, there is still some subjectivity to how to determine this, but we'll go over that in a little bit of detail in this presentation. And again, there's a lot more information that kind of goes into the background of this, and we'll hope to cover most of that in some upcoming webinars. So let's take a look at the risk determination process. This applies to all the vendors and suppliers, both when existing. And as you see, as we go through some of these steps, within the stream here, it could be minimized based on certain criteria and certain mitigating factors based on your own level of expertise, as well as the type of vendor that you're dealing with. So taking a look at these four, these are the basic ones that we're going to incorporate some risk to. The first would be the identification of the vendor. So we'll go over how to identify what type of vendor that we're dealing with. Secondly, we're going to send initial forms to the vendor, or basically we're going to gather information about that vendor. And that information is going to be data that you collect that would be specific to your process. Okay, so we'll take a look at that as well. Next, we're going to apply the risk numbering system. So I'll go over one of the techniques that we use. There are a few, but we'll take a look at one of them in this particular webinar. And finally, on the performance during the audit, we'll take a look at, again, how to mitigate some of those areas within the audit itself, and how to lessen the time a little bit for each one of those audits. So let's take a look at identifying the vendor. Couple of definitions here for a critical vendor. The critical vendor supplies goods or services that directly control or dictate the quality and integrity of drugs or devices. The operative word here is directly. So if they have a direct impact on your quality, on the way you make your drug or device, then they typically would be considered a critical vendor. For non-critical vendors, they supply goods or services that assist and support the quality of products. So on this, the operative words would be assist and support within the quality of the product. So they don't have a direct impact, but they do have some kind of surrounding emphasis on how you're making your drug or your device. So this is basically the first step in the determination of the type of audit required. Companies sometimes list the vendors within a document. That's certainly encouraged to do that. So once you make that determination, you're going to have an approved supplier list. So within that list, you're going to have all of your suppliers, either on a spreadsheet or some other automated system that you may have, and you're going to mark them as critical or non-critical. So that's the first step in identifying the vendors for your particular audit needs. So if we take a look at this, we have a sterilization company, Jones Sterilization. We have them identified as critical. Typically, any kind of sterilization company, if they're doing irradiation or any type of gamma ray sterilization, they're going to be considered, and it's industry standard, that they are critical. Pest control companies, typically non-critical. So they're supporting your facilities and your surrounding areas within your manufacturing organization. So typically they're pretty much non-critical. Packaging companies, depending on what type of packaging. I have this particular one, current packaging, marked as critical. And that's because this packaging, what I'm making the assumption on, is that they're doing specialized packaging for, say, refrigerated items. Okay, if you have a drug that needs to be refrigerated, 2 to 8C or freezing or that type of thing, and if there's special packaging procedures or work instructions that are needed for your device or drug, then they would most likely be considered critical. So gathering the information from your vendors and suppliers, I had this as a must because obviously you need to know everything about that vendor. And again, it's information about this company focusing on your needs as a company. So many of your vendors and suppliers may take on a lot of other responsibilities. They may have other clients that they're dealing with that have nothing to do with what they're supplying for you. So that will be key, and I'll talk about this during the audit performance section of this webinar, where you want to focus in on exactly what is needed for your company. So that information that you do gather, it's going to determine the level of risk associated with the vendor. So this example here is just a small sample of information used for risk determination. So let's take a look at that in a little bit more detail here. You have your vendors listed, and so we have their Jones Sterilization, your Acme Pest Control, and your Current Packaging. One of the first areas that we look at is the vendor failure rate. So, you know, if this vendor fails in its quality services to your company, okay, how likely is that? So for the sterilization, I have this listed as a 2 on a scale of 1 to 3 that we're using here for the numbering part of this risk. I have this as a level 2 for sterilization because as 3 being the highest level of failure, so detecting the failure or a failure being likely here for sterilization, I have it as a 2 because if you're going through the irradiation process, you're going to have certain controls within your own QA organization for your particular, say, drug, that you're going to be able to figure out if this product or service is going to be damaged by a failure from the vendor. So on the pest control, obviously it's a 1 because that's generally controlled within your own services organization. So your facilities manager will be taking care of that. Packaging I have is a level 2 as well for vendor failures. On the detectability, here we have is the problem or potential risk detectable within sterilization. So again, I'll have this as a level 3 because once this goes out and it comes back and maybe goes into the general public, can we really detect that there's a problem? And I have this as a 3 because certainly it's a high risk for within the sterilization versus, say, the pest control, where you could easily detect the problem here. If there's a problem with your pest control, you're going to see bugs and rodents around your manufacturing floor. Packaging, I have that as a level 2, and again, there's so many questions that go behind the scenes for each one of these major questions that we have for our risk scenario here. Consumer impact is the risk to the consumer, and obviously if you need a sterile instrument or if your process needs to be sterilized, then that's a major impact to the consumer. Pest control, I have it as a 1 because of the detectability and failure rate is also a 1 because the risk over to the consumer is minimized because you're catching that beforehand. Packaging I have as a 3 because, again, if there's something wrong with the packaging and there is some type of error within the refrigeration and it goes out to the consumer, then that's a very high risk if you have a contaminated product that's getting into humans. So I have that as rated as a 3. So if you add them up, you're going to come up with a grading scale. So I have there on the bottom, some folks use good, critical, or catastrophic as ratings, or low, medium, and high. We have here a scale of A through D, with D being the highest risk, A being the lowest risk. So if you add them up, right, you have 8 being a level D, a 3 for the pest control, so that would fall under level A, and then a 7 for packaging would be a level C. Some companies use 1 through 25. Some companies use 1 through 100. So depending on what you want to do for your grading, I like to try to keep it as simple as possible with as few denominators in there as possible as well. Okay? So let's take that information and go on here further and apply that risk. So once you gather all that information about the vendor and determine the numbering, then you could really apply this risk scoring system to your vendor selection process. So you have several options on determining the type of qualification that you need, and that would be obviously an on-site audit, followed by qualifying the vendor via a checklist, qualifying the vendor by past performance via a retrospective analysis. So you've already dealt with this vendor before, so you're going to go retrospectively back and determine your risk. And then finally, the other option is no audit required, or there's really minimal impact for this audit. So you define all of this, hopefully within your SOP criteria. So most companies have an SOP on vendor qualification processes. And if you use the previous example that we had on the other slide, these would be the ratings. So a D grade would require mandatory an on-site audit. A C grade would require a comprehensive checklist and sometimes an on-site audit. Okay, so I just wanted to make that caveat there that C could be an on-site audit as well, but generally it requires just a comprehensive checklist. A B grade would require just a standard checklist on items that you typically ask to qualify a vendor. And then an A grade would either require no audit at all or just a simple checklist, sending out to the company and making sure they're a viable company financially and so forth. So they're the ratings that we would use on applying the risk for this particular webinar in this particular situation. Okay? So now let's take a look at the performance of your audits. So you could further streamline your on-site audits. So once you, and again, the on-site audits are, folks, they're really the most expensive, the most time-consuming audits that you can go through, but they're also the most important because typically they would be either a critical vendor or sometimes a first-time vendor that you want to go out and visit. So we're going to take a look at some of the ways to streamline using those risk techniques for those vendors, again, who are critical and again, who require a first-time on-site audit. Some samples of mitigating the risk for each audit include, if they're a long-time vendor, you want to concentrate on those areas that may have been missed in previous reports. So many times when we engage with one of our clients, the first thing I'll ask is, has this company been audited in the past? And if they have, I'd like to see at least the last 2 reports. Certainly concentrating on the very last report. And within those reports, you can concentrate on any of the past observations that they had. So even though they may have sent a valid response back and it was an accepted response for an observation, you still want to kind of hone in on those areas because it's just, especially if the audit just happened, say, a year ago or 2 years ago, you want to make sure that they're still up to speed and they're in compliance with that particular observation. And again, the second thing here is the most important is focus only on those products and services that apply to your company. Again, I've been on joint audits before where other folks within the audit are asking questions about the company, and the representative or host at that particular time for that company just goes on a tangent about so many other things within their company and how great they are and what else other services. And that's great, but you could waste a good hour going through that, and that hour is very important to gather the information that you need for your company. So other ways to expedite the on-site audit include review as much material in advance. So I always ask for certain documents up front, in particular your SOP index. So you want to get that index so you can be prepared to know which documents that company may have that you want to go through. Okay, any other material, lot number, batch records for particular lots, and so forth. You want to get that, at least let them know that you're going to be asking for that. And that leads into the second part here is request a staging of those documents. So a lot of times these companies aren't really going to give you a copy of their SOPs. Some do, but most don't. So you want to, again, tell them, I need these documents for these areas staged and ready to go for review when I get on site, so I don't have to waste time looking for those documents. And finally, understanding where you have to look within an SOP for your compliance needs. This happens a lot, say, if you're doing a European audit and, say, in France, many of the SOPs are in French, okay? And what they'll do, if you don't have an on-site translator there from your own company, what they're going to do is they are going to supply someone, and that person may read line by line the entire SOP to you. So say you wanted to see an SOP on their training personnel. They're going to go through the entire process and take and take you through and read that SOP for you. But if you tell them up front that you need to see, okay, within that training SOP, I want to see where it states how often the employees need to be trained on GMP, how often or what type of documents or evidence does this SOP say that each employee has to provide once they're completed the training. So areas like that. For management review, you want to go right to the section where it says how often they do management reviews and what areas they're covering. So know your SOPs, know what you want to look for, and then go right to those sections to save time. And obviously all this includes being prepared and being organized. They're probably two of the most important things you could do within on-site audits. You want to make sure that you're getting the biggest bang for your buck during those 8 hours or 16 hours that you may have from a company. And the companies are going to appreciate it as well. They're taking the time out to host you as the auditee, and you want to make sure that you're using their time in an effective manner as well. So speaking of time, the typical length of time for these audits, these are sample length of times based on many years of prior experience that I've been doing on audits, and our company has as well. The average quality audit is 2 days. So a straight quality audit, you want to qualify this vendor, typically takes about 2 days. We do many of them in 1 day, depending on the complexity of that vendor, and again, depending on the risk factor that we've assigned to that vendor. And sometimes the 1 day could be with more than one person as well. We may assign 2 people to split up our work during that 1 day. But the typical figure, the actual length of time could be 1 or 2 days, but typically it's around 2 days. Sterile manufacturing audits are a little bit different. They're a little bit more complex. You have to go into the clean rooms. You have to take a look at all the technical details. You want to look at the bioburden rates and all that good stuff around sterilization. And they normally, in our experience, have taken about 3 days, and sometimes with more than one person as well. Distributors, logistic vendors such as FedEx or UPS, they're typically 1 day in length. There you want to get in and look at their warehousing and their separation of goods in and goods out, and if they have an automated system for that, for tracking of that and releasing products, and their QC labs if they may have that. It gets a little bit more detailed for these folks when you're going to have cold storage. So you want to take a look at validation records for their refrigerators and freezers and that type of thing. So their ambient temperature and everything that goes along with specific, real detailed storage areas. Software vendor audits. We've been doing a lot of them lately. A lot of companies are taking a look at what type of software they have and if the vendors are supplying the right quality services that they need to be in compliance. And they're typically done in 1 to 2 days. And that also depends on whether or not they have a large data center that you want to take a walk through, and you'd certainly want to eyeball that and take a look at the security features and are their racks locked down? Are they under lock and key? Is there a combination? What type of fire prevention, UPS, backup systems do they have? But generally they're about 1 to 1.5 days in length. PAI readiness audits typically take a minimum of 5 days because there's so much information that we need to gather to get you ready to apply for your NDA or ANDA, one of these readiness audits. So they're typically longer in length and usually go about 5 days. Now, as I mentioned, sometimes you could have more than one person. You could expedite those audits by increasing the number of your auditors. However, I have to caution you that you absolutely need to work as a team to split up the work and collaborate as needed. It makes no sense for two people to look at the same SOP. So split up your work, and that's why that SOP index is very important. So you can go through and say, okay, Jim, you take all the quality side, and Bob, you take all of the facilities and clean room activities, or someone else could do the manufacturing and take a look at the batch records and so forth. Okay? So let's take a look at the different questions that you could ask. Again, this is all based on risk. So for all of these slides, for all this information, there's a lot of background information that goes into this. But the basics are come up with a risk scoring system so you can start to apply some of this for each particular slide that I'm going through. So you have different vendors that you're dealing with. Every company does. So there's different questions you could ask that vary based on that type of vendor and, again, the type of risk. So 3 examples here are for the sterile environments. You want to certainly hone in on the proof of viable, non-viable particular testing, if that's part of it. For the irradiation, bioburden testing, if someone else is doing that testing, or they're doing their own testing, are they doing quarterly dose testing, that type of thing. So you really want to be specific when you go into some of these technical audits, and be prepared again with your questions specific to what they're doing for you. Okay? In manufacturing areas, you want to, maybe when you do your walkthrough and your tour, and you take a look at some of the particular instruments that they have, you want to get that instrument number and then pull the calibration records and make sure that the calibrations are A, up to date, and B, have they used the proper instrumentation for the calibration? Are they, what reference standards did they use, and so forth. You want to pull the maintenance records for certain items. And if you're going through a warehouse, you maybe pull the temperature charts if they're tracking that, or for a clean room. You want to take a look at the magnehelic gauges and the calibration of those instruments as well. For distribution, you want to take a look at some sampling procedures, or what their sampling procedures are. So you want to ask, do they do 100%? Do they do every other? Do they do, one per box? Whatever their sampling procedure is. If they're, as I mentioned before, if they're taking care of freezers and refrigerators, and you have some of those drugs or medical devices that fall under that category, and they're trucked in, you want to take a look at the logging and temp tail records from those trucks, and if they're downloaded to your client or not. All the cold storage validation documentation that I mentioned. What type of temperature probes do they use? Do they use high, medium, low? Do they use 8 probe, 4 probe? Those type of questions for distribution would be mandatory and could help speed up the process as well. So let's take a look at a case scenario here. This is a raw material supplier. So as we take a look at all the information about this raw material supplier, the risk to the patient that we determined was high if that material failed. So right off the bat, it's a high risk for human consumption or human use if it's a medical device. The ability to detect the failure is high because the vendor performs their own lot testing and sterility before the release of the product. So you can detect if there's going to be a problem. It would be highly detectable. The risk of material failure is low because you've used a supplier for the past 8 years, so you have some history there. Okay, so always take that into account on some of your vendor audits, because a lot of companies have been around a while. They've audited the same firm several times if they're doing every 2 years or every 3 years. So you want to take a look at the history. If they've had no FDA 483 or warning letters, and and you haven't found too many observations, then take that into consideration. So for this particular company, I have it as the risk of material failure is low. Because of that, they've had a quality and service records are ideal, and industry references from other companies are very favorable for this particular supplier. So based on the previous slides, if I incorporate the risk into this, this vendor would most likely fit into the B category. The B, it moved from an A to a B because the risk to patient is high if the material fails. So you do want to, certainly either, if it's a first-time audit for this raw material supplier, you may want to go out and visit. But if not, you want to send out a regular questionnaire, gathering the information that you need to qualify this particular vendor. Okay, so if we had more time, I can go through a lot of other scenarios, and again, on the upcoming webinars, we'll be doing that, going through some more detail on what goes on behind the scenes to create this type of scenario. So let me summarize here in the couple minutes I have left here. There are different types of audits for different types of vendors and suppliers. Just keep that in mind. The risk-based approach for level determination of the level of your audit, your type of audit, and the length of time could be applied to all vendors and suppliers. You could expedite your audits using risk and previous data from previous audits. The scoring systems vary in complexity, so obviously use what best fits your firm. You may have a risk-based approach to validation. So again, take that information that's already been developed for your company and apply it to your auditing process. It really works because we use it, and I'm telling you, it certainly saves us a lot of time. The length of, and speaking of time again, the length of time varies for each one of the audits, but averages do exist to help you, to guide you in your determination on how many folks you're going to need from your organization and when to schedule these audits. Because scheduling is one of the biggest problems with some of these audits, because you're going to tell them you're going to be there for 3 days, and they may have some resistance to that. But if you tell them that this is exactly what you need and explain why, then you can usually get around that problem. So this presentation here that we just did was on external suppliers. However, similar techniques do exist for internal auditing, and we may have a webinar for your own internal auditing needs as well in the next coming weeks. So, so again, I wanted to thank everyone for their time this afternoon, and if there's any questions, certainly Becky's going to go over that right now, and I'll be glad to take them. And I look forward to seeing a lot of you again in some future webinars. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Really appreciate you taking the time to share that information with us. We will open the floor to questions now, and while you're typing in those questions, I would like to let you know that this webinar has been recorded and will be available on the USDM website, which of course, usdm.com. Many of you are very familiar with USDM capabilities, but around your compliance projects. But did you know that USDM offers 3 different delivery options? The first is our project team, which supports start-to-finish compliance. It's led by our subject matter expert practice directors, or SME project managers, and utilizes the USDM team members with various skill sets for cost effectivity. Based on client preference, we can be flexible with our availability to work on-site or remotely as best suits each individual project. The second option is our USDM staff augmentation. So if you need extra hands to help meet project deadlines and support your internally managed projects with solid team members offering skills and experience specifically needed for your project, this would be a good option. The goal for USDM is client delight, resulting in repeat business. So we're going to place people that are experienced and seasoned, most often with our team, and trained by our team, which we believe are the best of the best. So the third option is USDM On Demand, and that's a blended on-site, onshore, offshore model, and that's for managed services, meaning development and support of validation testing. This approach incorporates the cost savings of offshoring while reducing the risk, ensuring higher success than the traditional offshoring. So lots of ways that we can help you. We just need to find out what your pain points are, what your questions are, and how we can best meet your needs. Okay, looks like our questions are coming in. Thank you very much for participating. Bob, our first question here is asking if a vendor is critical and you have performed an audit in the last 2 years, how often do you need to revisit?
Okay, for critical vendors, 2 years is about the average, so you certainly want to go back and audit them again. And if they're critical and you've done an on-site, it would require, again based on risk, another on-site audit. So typically some of the critical vendors, such as some of the sterilization or injection molding vendors, would have to be done on a yearly basis, or are typically done on a yearly basis. You don't want to go any more than 3 years, and again, the industry standard is about every 2 years for these critical vendors, with again the caveat being that some of those vendors, based on risk, you want to see them every year for an on-site visit, and again, they are your highly critical vendors that you're dealing with. So to answer your question, yeah, 2 years, that's fine. You want to do another one very shortly. Okay.
Very good. Thanks, Bob. Next question is from Joe. We have vendors in our system who have never been audited. If we determine that an audit is required, what is your experience in these vendors being cooperative?
Okay, Joe. Well, we've had varying experiences with vendors for cooperation. Most of them are cooperative because they still want to, remember, they're your vendors and they want to continue to do business with you. However, if it's a large vendor that you're dealing with and you may have a very small part of what they're selling, then sometimes you're going to get some resistance. And I've seen that where they're going to look at you and say, well, you know, you represent a very, very small percentage of our sales here, Mr. or Mrs. Client. So, you know, we're going to put you off for another year. So what you want to do is tell them when you're explaining the audit that you need to do this audit in the spirit and of continuous improvement. So it's not so much to determine whether or not they're still going to be a vendor of yours, but, you know, in it where, you know, you're doing this audit to help both companies, okay? So I always start out with the opening meeting telling folks that look, we're not the FDA, and folks on the phone here, you're not the FDA going in conducting the audit. You're conducting the audit on behalf of your company. So it is in the spirit of continuous improvement that you want to conduct these audits. So for the most part, they're very cooperative. Every now and then you're going to get some resistance, and they may, you know, keep holding you off. But just be persistent and let them know, because you're following the risk-based approach, that you're going to mitigate the time needed for that audit. You're going to be very well prepared and organized, and you're not going to take a lot of time away from their folks. Okay?
Very good. Thank you. Looks like our question next is from Zachary. We have some foreign suppliers. Is it better to use local resources or our own resources here to conduct the audit, since they're more familiar with our process, looking at this from cost perspective?
Oh, okay. So from a cost perspective, it's certainly more cost effective to use local resources in another country, obviously, for the obvious reasons of travel cost, right, and logistics around that. However, many times I've seen that companies will use their own resources, say based here in the States, to send over, because they're familiar with either your QA process or your technical process that you're dealing with. As a consultant, we're asked to do these audits overseas just because of our expertise. But for your own companies, it's certainly better if you can get local resources. The only problem is that many of those resources do not exist overseas. So it comes down to you have to use your own resources. But again, to mitigate that risk, or to mitigate the cost rather, I'm sorry, you apply the risk and you could tighten up the time frames. The other way to get around that is to lump your audits together. If you have 2 or 3 companies in Germany, say one in Germany, one in France, you want to get them together on one trip. Okay, especially if you're only doing a 1 or 2 day audit, you could combine them in a week, week and a half, and you could certainly save a lot of back and forth travel cost that way. Okay, so there are ways to reduce the travel expenses. If you do have the opportunity to use local resources, by all means, go ahead and do it if they're qualified as a qualified auditor. If not, use your own, apply the risk, and you guys will be fine.
Very good. Thank you, Bob. All right. Looks like we need to wrap it up here. I do appreciate everyone taking the time to join us, and those of you typing in compliments and thank yous, we certainly appreciate that. We do would like to encourage you to visit the USDM website and review any upcoming webinar events there, as well as the recorded sessions of previously presented topics. We would invite you also to join our discussion on the LinkedIn USDM group forum. Stay up to date there with upcoming events and presentations, and do let us know that we're on the right track with your feedback and suggestions. If you have specific pain points or topics that you could use a little insight or direction from our team, please just let us know. We're happy to work with you there. Thanks again, Bob, for presenting today, and thanks everyone for taking the time to join us. We do appreciate this opportunity to team with you in working towards excellence and compliance. Have a wonderful day.